I've done 7 teaching contracts in 6 Chinese provinces, mostly at universities, intermittently from 2010 to 25, and towards the end, unwittingly showed regular regional and world maps from the internet on projected screens in various settings that brought trouble and made further work difficult to secure. I am a white Englishman and was 55 at the time. My situation was centered on a Western culture open evening event in English at a high-ranked university in Nanjing that exampled the Chinese inability for Western levels of critical thinking as segueing into the culture's power structures with their fear and obfuscation, alongside the problems of authoritarian values of society placed over liberal values of individuality. The central government employs Westerners in education to introduce their thought and civilization as well as languages, as part of its ongoing opening up policy beginning 1978 for an increased integration with the wider world. But conflicts can emerge on site, with Western values being in greater opposition to restrictive and backward Chinese culture than the personnel there generally understand. The event was part of a series of English conversation meetings organized by me and an American lecturer, entirely extra to contract for the department's benefit, for 2 groups of 8 or fewer students in their early 20s. On this occasion, however, the management brainlessly co-opted the meeting without conferring and ushered 35 students plus 3 curious Chinese staff, as meaning conversation with us was impossible, and we had to change quickly to a largely one-way presentation, with most of the contribution from me. I talked rapidly through 200 PowerPoint slides on America and Britain, followed by some wide-ranging Western-style debate topics and discussions, all from files used many times before in courses that I'd long since screened for politics, religion, sexuality, and similar issues as might impinge on convictions to cause conflict, at least for expected Western levels of critique and common sense. In the questions period at the end, however, a girl complained politely but assertively that Taiwan is part of China, in relation to maps that she implied didn't show Taiwan correctly. I'd said nothing about Taiwan, while she was seemingly unable to specify just which maps she was unhappy about, but I was then reported to the police by unspecified people for seditious activity and reprimanded by the department, then later called to 2 further disciplinary meetings, with my job and apartment threatened. The event was early in my contract, but the conversation, meetings, and all other events involving me beyond timetabled sessions, including a music history series I'd started, and again for free, were suspended for the remainder, while wider professional ethics, with responsibility towards fee-paying students' entitlement to such events, were cynically dispensed with. Though I was happy enough to do what they wanted, the issue resurfaced several times because instructions were never clear out of their background contradictions, and even at the meetings with managers they disagreed with each other over which maps and discussions were approved and whether they had to issue from a government website. My foreign culture PowerPoint files included hundreds of maps of every kind, as appearing every few slides, yet the managers at first asked me not to use any, in showing their ignorance about the world and such teaching. It transpired that a surreptitious contingent allied with the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, local branch, may have been out to make its presence known, the girl being in a group of students who went to the police for a grievance that would be retained indefinitely against me, but which I could see was part of the climate of unease and anxiety maintained through the university environment. Ripples of foreboding were created, while me and the American fell about laughing at the portentousness. I was advised that discussing the Taiwan issue from any angle, particularly on social media, can bring someone serious problems, and indeed, when I mentioned it on the main WeChat platform to anyone, they stopped replying to me completely, no matter how much I'd talked with them before and how daft it looked. All Chinese presumed I'd done something quite wrong, where explaining to them was outside of both their low consciousness ability to analyze with objectivity and their developing society's weaker conceptual differentiation on the normative level. Although I finished the contract and then gained a shorter one, a further contract awarded me was revoked, where I seemed to be blacklisted, and I stopped looking for work in China. I dealt with the girl at the time saying most maps are political, where countries in different colors just show existing border crossings, with immigration control enforced by whatever governments, and aren't any sort of stance on the legality or rightfulness of anything or how things should be. However, after researching and making sense of the maps later, her question emerged as either confused or disingenuous from those behind her, since neither Taiwan nor anyone else is saying that Taiwan is legally separate to China because it claims China all as China claims it. Both sides officially insist and have always insisted on a single China as mainland plus the island of Taiwan. She'd been led to think that political maps are legal, or jurisdiction maps, as government approved, showing the extent of claimed control, not actual control. Taiwan is part of China, as the Socialist People's Republic of China, PRC, legally, or China part of the Capitalist Republic of China, ROC, Taiwan, legally, but not politically, where China is controlled by a government and laws in Beijing, and Taiwan is controlled by a separate government and laws in Taipei. The whole map situation is a complete non-issue and farce, but where subtle confusion is used as another tool for ongoing subservience towards authority and bolstering the power hierarchy to circumvent any slips. The government tries to say that merely the viewing of de facto political maps, as irrespective of its legal claims, is unacceptable, just because the Taipei government isn't recognized legally, and then they'd rather put up fake maps of control. This mindlessness is part of the Chinese capacity for whitewashing and fantasy, alongside their adopted socialism placing theory over worldly facts. De facto maps are more uncomfortable for China, with its socialism as necessarily all-embracing and shepherding, than for Taiwan, with its capitalism as built-in freedom of thought and freedom from government, and hence diversity of view and discussion. Socialism is intolerant of internal difference, and particularly of wayward territories, and hence psychologically must worry more about Taiwan than Taiwan worries about China. Prioritizing values of society is a mistake and essentially precarious, where exceptions within socialism indicate the falsity of the whole. Taiwan persists because it's superior to China, where values of individuality, allowing critical minds to rise, are needed even for the most sheep-like populations, and in some ways, particularly for these. The Chinese, seeing a self-contained and free-thinking Westerner as beyond their universe, often shocks them in indicating their tentacular authoritarian web, small-minded control over the next person, and denial of human spirit aren't universal. The prior dynastic period of sequestration from fear of the world beyond morphed into socialist isolationism, with its demands for self-sufficiency, and where the dynasties ended because of modernity from Western capitalism, and the socialists only continue because of their covert importing from Western capitalism. Values of individuality are always ascendant. Political maps, as objective and pragmatic, show which government controls land at the present time, as disregarding whatever legal or future political designs. But for the questioning girl's concerns, under Chinese law, the maps can also be seen as the government's legal area and the Taiwanese government's illegal area, or vice versa under Taiwanese law. Here, if a political map showed the two in the same color, it would instead, rather than being a fantasy map of current control, indicate that the situation she's worried about is correct, rather than grossly incorrect and in need of attention as the Chinese see it. They quietly claim there's a problem, but instead of facing it, they want a fake map to say to themselves that there is no problem. The different color doesn't show the Taiwan state having legal recognition by anyone, nor whether it's run by aliens from Saturn, and instead only that it's there. If unification with Taiwan is the goal, then talk to the Taiwanese, not invent a map that tells lies, and then get all flustered and silly when others don't use it. The authorities purposely conflate legal maps showing land that is claimed as de jure jurisdiction and political maps showing land that is controlled as de facto current reality. The Chinese state doesn't recognize the Taiwan state and vice versa, but they need to be there for such non-recognition. Taiwan has its own government, politics, economy, police, armed forces, education system, health system, and the rest of state organs, all controlled by Taipei and nothing controlled by Beijing. Yet China wants make-believe maps indicating Taiwan is already part of China politically, and that there is no such government or state. Beijing is considering military action to make Taiwan part of China politically as well as legally. yet also insinuates that Taiwan is already part of China politically. My political maps likewise put in different colors and similarly labeled North and South Korea, plus Western Sahara and Morocco when there are recognition disputes with these pairs, and Greenland as separate to Denmark when it's part of Denmark in the wider sense. The Korean situation parallels the Chinese, where the antagonistic states finished fighting mid-last century, but continue declaring the same single jurisdiction and not recognizing each other. The maps further showed the two border areas disputed with India since its independence, 2 years prior to the PRC state, of Aksai Chin, or Leh District, and South Tibet, or Arunachal Pradesh, in the Indian color and within its territory. Both these areas are larger than Taiwan, but no one noticed, as no students are not even aware of them and understand nothing of India as being a very different civilization beyond the Himalayas. Showing Aksai Chin as Indian was indeed erroneous, though, as it's controlled, and probably rightly so, by Xinjiang in China, while there are several lesser-known border disputes with other neighbors. Then Taiwan might complain about the maps in parallel jurisdictional terms, that mainland China isn't in the same color as Taiwan, but where the ROC should be recognized, not the PRC. Mainland political separatism for many is anathema just the same, and neither want to be first to stoop down to withdrawal and separation. No Taiwan government has declared nor wanted to declare that it's an independent country, as then it would have to give up its historical claims to control China, and where any designs on China would then be as a foreign invader. And moreover, on political maps, Taiwan's color is often gray, as indicating it's a separate functioning state, but not a separate country. The current Taipei and Beijing legal maps are almost identical, with no cross-strait disjunction where the Taipei political system is claimed for China as the China system for Taiwan. Only if Taiwan declared formal independence or China renounced its claims on Taiwan, ideally as part of the same process, would their jurisdiction and political maps become the same. China sees a current stability in the successive Taiwan governments entertaining their mainland claims, even as currently impossible, rather than giving up and permanently going alone, where they would pursue more international diplomatic and trade relations, particularly with the West. The CCP constantly associates this possibility in its state media with dire military intervention and general foreboding and pretentiousness. China has land borders with 14 countries, and none are strongly westernized as providing it with geopolitical buffers. But losing Taiwan completely would compromise this in creating proximity to a fully Western allied country, including its potential as a vast aircraft carrier just offshore for war. Taiwan's marginally different ethnicity inclines more to an individual rather than herd mentality, and hence looks to the West, but much of the population would agree with China over political reunification under the right conditions rather than separation, while it partly also shares culture, language, history, and geography. Moreover, by contrast, almost all other island countries in the Pacific region are already allied with America and hosts its military bases for blockading and escalation options. One slide had a world map for explaining the British climate with its North Atlantic current, but was legal rather than political, with China and Taiwan in the same color. Yet it also put the word Taiwan against Taiwan and in the same font as other country names, which I'd never previously noticed as it was nothing to do with English weather. This suggested to unsophisticated Chinese minds, going off at stupid tangents, that despite the color, Taiwan was legally or formally independent, and strangely, this map brought particular consternation in the management meetings. Under Chinese law, the Taiwan government is illegal, and under Taiwan law, the Chinese government is illegal, but both the two main Taiwan parties of historical right-wing Kuomintang, or Chinese Nationalist Party, KMT, and more recent center-left Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, agree in the wider sense with the CCP's One China policy. Nonetheless, the KMT favors future unity with China more than the DPP, as involving a nascent independence movement under Taiwan nationalism, and hence Beijing prefers the KMT to be in power. The PRC and ROC legal maps equivalence today is preceded by the KMT as ruling China from 1928 to 49, and then for most of Taiwan history thereafter, retaining ROC claims on Mongolia and the neighboring Tuva Republic within Russia until 1946 and 2002. These were controlled by the Qing dynasty at its dissolution in 1911 in the Xinhai Revolution and passed to the new ROC of 1912, which never previously negotiated their independence. Governments may provide legal maps, including for propaganda, with territory not under their control, but normally maps produced are just political for worldly control that has to be dealt with today. On political maps today, Taiwan also wants to see China given in a gray color, as the PRC not being the recognized country and only the functioning de facto state. Hence, my maps in fact sided with China, where Taiwan was given in gray as the anomaly, all in agreement with the girl and reflecting most countries' pro-China diplomatic position, and not at all seditious or separatist as they were later accused of being. Moreover, with the political situation currently stable and the PRC's tacit acceptance, despite the bluster, it was hence even more a non-issue, and obviously being used for other reasons. Hawaii has an independence movement, yet is part of the U.S., but again, nobody is made to go in puerile trepidation and worry over it, while all governments and mapmakers understand the basic China-Taiwan legal unities, but political separation. The issue as another of the Chinese ruling system's crude deceptions and ploys to create fear, and thereby presuppose respect towards itself and those benefiting in the background, is out of regular political maps slyly taken to be legal maps promoting separation. The simple understanding that Taiwan is part of China legally, if with competing jurisdictions, but currently not politically, is conflated to form a vaguely defined sensitive area for apprehension and stultification, all continuous with the rest of knowledge control, including in education, internet, media, and books. The idea that no one should say the wrong things about Taiwan is purely for more Kafkaesque menace to bolster unthinking regard for authority and orders coming down, whatever they are, and to forget about one's self-respect or humanity, should people have them. The students and everyone in the city or the entire province could have the view that Taiwan should be or is another country, or that the KMT should rule China, and it would change nothing in the cross-strait situation, except that they'd be standing up to the six socialists' intrusive authority. The whole idea of topic sensitivity is fake, and a strategy to quell sentiments of other kinds that are always rising as might impinge on the existing hierarchy personnel. Most of the time, the system doesn't care what anyone thinks about anything, as long as it's ignorant and poorly grounded, particularly with wider socialist theory placed over practice and market reality. The fear is nothing to do with the external Taiwan government and everything to do with internal control. Elites with limited justification for their position as leaders or behind leaders, and instead being concerned for power relations, want the working population's spare attention taken up by notions of ambiguous foreign and not real domestic unfairness, ineptitude, and problems. It's even possible the Beijing elite is on great terms with the Taipei elite and are clinking glasses over a successful stratagem on both sides for keeping their own peoples downtrodden and the respective tiers of privilege in place, while misappropriating money from consequent military spending, including for their further entrenchment. Chinese news media, such as the China Daily National English Language newspaper, has articles across many years on Taiwan with the same basic content, to keep up a sense of antagonism and instability in shepherding the public around a distant issue, as seemingly unsettling, but of likely no material significance to it. The hatred and mockery towards, plus effort to control the thought of those below, coming down from the elite, as a society's most powerful people, with no one above, is out of fear of people noticing that the power relations are arbitrary, and thence lower tiers usurping the elite. Here, this is papered over by the assumed theoretical system's downgrading and elimination of individual views. Government echelons are perfectly aware that the maps are a fuss over sweet nothing, where they have to try and keep their faces straight in presuming authority and the public's deference towards them. Wrongthink is deemed as forming one's own critique or perspective out of objective and fair-minded observation and research, including to unpack the purposely fuzzy Taiwan issue, And indeed, if people can be stopped from thinking at university, they can be stopped anywhere. Socialism structures no personal liberty into itself, so that political thought and then meaningful inquiry of any kind is seen only as a matter for the government and not the people. Thinking is uppity and subversive, where instead the individual's role is a brick in the wall worker bee and subhuman puppet to the system, although socialism is less of a discontinuity for the Chinese masses with their lower consciousness. Modernity is all imported from the West, but then necessarily deployed via imperious government instruction and strong central control, rather than any local understanding out of involvement in its development. China never had the major intellectual movements leading to the modern world of Renaissance, scientific revolution, industrial revolution, and enlightenment, so that the basic relationship with material life is befuddlement. The fakery of socialism's downgrading of the individual segues into the fakery of the modern environment claimed as theirs. The government pushes the view on students, staff, and the public that it already has an undetermined level of political control over Taiwan as transitioning out of the culture and geography, and managers insisted that mapmakers showing Taiwan with any political separation are hence working for Western conspiratorial separatist forces. Other especially egregious internationally prepared maps or schematics that I unwittingly used were those only of China, where Taiwan wasn't shown at all, because China doesn't control it. The Taiwan government's agreement with the wider legal unity is lost on them, while its current political separation is denied in Chinese doublethink. No one considers instead that the garbage fuss just another CCP repressive mechanism directed against its own, and where it then tries to shift it onto outside sinister agents and their mapmakers. At my Western culture event, the questioning girl and the control behind her had an agenda, not me. Moreover, by contrast, international political maps show the main areas of China with separatist tendencies of Tibet and Xinjiang as part of China, because they're controlled by Beijing, and regardless of how wrongful the mapmakers might take this to be. However, the university where my map troubles took place was in Nanjing, which was the ROC's capital city during part of the KMT's 2 decades in power, along with capital for some of the royal dynasties before the communist takeover and their switch back to Beijing. Perhaps the PRC's Taiwan repression strategy is greater, with more government concern for opinion there, and where the 1912 ROC headquarters are retained as a museum. From 1912 to 27, the country was too unstable for the ROC to change the capital from Beijing, and then from 1937 to 45, it moved southwest to Chongqing, preceding the Japanese vindictive mass murder in Nanjing as part of its invasion begun in 1931. Most countries don't recognize Taiwan legally, as China requests of them in order to keep diplomatic and trade relations with the more important state, but also aren't crazed enough to have a problem with millions of political maps that include East Asia, produced outside of China, showing Taiwan as autonomous because it is, and where anything else would be bonkers falsification. On the contrary, it's PRC political maps that are conspiratorial and deceptive, even while Western leaders being in the same club of privilege and power play, similar fear generation and war threat games against their own people. Its regular elite efforts at directing attention to threats and troubles abroad, and away from domestic arbitrary inequality and injustice, and will go along with the obfuscation of basic Taiwan stability as required. In China's regular weekly meritocratic system, the hierarchy's only substantive concern is safeguarding itself, where its members privately laugh almost as much as Westerners do at the moronic masses falling for the manufactured specious sensitivity and not thinking critically. Critical thinking is a threat to any social structure and polity, whether only in terms of superficial cognitive dissonance in the sheeple, or more seriously in terms of the occasional more capable minds. The elite privilege is carried forward by ignorance out of restricted information and restricted thinking expectations towards what the background control really means to the people involved. Censorship and oppression aren't to control people with a view to gaining Taiwan or anything else, but instead just what they appear to be and no more, to control people. China's officially unresolved cross-strait situation suits its parasitical ruling group, in parallel with situations in Korea with North and South, India with Kashmir, Israel with Palestine, and many similar places, along with the entire Cold War's fear of the other, and its hangover to the present with the Western Bloc's bizarre demonization of Russia. Moreover, the Korea situation, bordering on China, as officially a politically divided single country where both sides claim both parallels, China-Taiwan, while showing how right-wing values of individuality, in allowing the more critically minded and hence innovative to rise, produce much better results than left-wing values of society, even for sheep-like East Asian groups. The China and Korea dichotomies have to be artificially maintained, as under freer interaction, the left-wing sides would naturally unravel and fall to the right, and the elites wouldn't have fake external enemies anymore. China's importing of modernity from the West, who created it out of right-wing values, is a preposterous contradiction and foolhardiness ongoing since the 1972 American rapprochement. China and North Korea may hate Taiwan and South Korea because of the potential out of their proximity for foreign influence, including war, but they're also very useful for internal control. These are also proxy points of tension against America and the West, with Taiwan a shifted expression of self-hatred, where mainland failings are blamed on the island, that is China, but not China. The Chinese elite know that Taiwanese individuality, with its potential for insight, is superior to Chinese collectivity with its groupthink. Regardless of society being the situating environment and custodian of knowledge and expertise, all of it originally comes from single minds working on problems and gaining understanding that they only then communicate to others. Innovation issues from the private and subjective reflection that the socialists hate, including for socialist theory in the first place, while committees, by contrast, understand nothing. Then to the southwest, the worrisome potential foreign influence of India, with its far richer culture, is contained by permanent insincere border disputes and the wider buffer subcultural area of Tibet, while to the west, Xinjiang borders onto 5 geographically remote states, and to the north, often barren Inner Mongolia and independent Mongolia dampen ongoing Russian hegemony. To the south, Hong Kong plus Macau at their major river estuary provide frontier border town buffers, absorbing foreign influence, while having neurotic detachment and overcharging passing traffic with little interest in repeat business. Their internal borders with the mainland retain extensive police checks after the end of their European colonial control, while powerful Hong Kong has the border town of the Shenzhen Autonomous Zone with its freer market system. Buffer areas with their intermediate cultures and ethnicities provide containment and screening zones against the wider world's cultures and achievements, rather than potential foreign military bridgehead threats. Areas within China are deemed autonomous and outside the provincial administrative system and hinterland, and indeed Taiwan is already described as part of the one country, two systems policy, out of the largely unaltered post-colonial Hong Kong and Macau situations. Hence, if Taiwan was controlled by China and became another gateway to the mainland, it would seemingly be allowed to retain its politics and character unaltered. Moreover, whereas China has shown some forbearance with its one country, two systems, if Taiwan had control, perhaps by contrast, it would insist on right-wing politics for all of China alongside the seaward border areas. Then the pretense that Beijing already controls Taiwan politically comes from its parallel minimal intervention in Hong Kong and Macau. More grotesque displays of control are reserved for the larger geopolitical concerns of Tibet and Xinjiang, beyond the defining Eastern Heartland and ethnic Han. However, over time, China, despite its background socialist character, slowly gets more right-wing and closer to Taiwan to dissolve the whole question. Furthermore, one fine means of unification might be to offer Taiwan a suspension of mainland CCP and PRC rule and give the Taipei government power over all China for 4 years to see what they can do, followed by a public election, including where, if the socialist system was reinstated, there would be a return to no further elections, and with Taipei accepting the result. Such a gesture would impress the entire world and could solve the problem without a shot fired, while aligning with both Chinese culture's harmony and conflict avoidance and with the important ancient military thinker Sun Tzu, where battles are won intelligently without fighting. Such adult compromise isn't possible within psychotic socialism, though, as presupposing the theoretical system above individuals means it can't be set aside to create room for the opposing spirit that is needed for this. Meanwhile, adulthood, as independence and autonomy, is likewise anathema to socialism, with instead baby imagery promoted everywhere as total dependence, cluelessness, and absence of criticality. Then with everything just imported and nothing taken responsibility for, everything is unserious novelty in a sense of play, as also sometimes in Southeast Asia. Following the Western Culture event, a senior manager who had been there asked for copies of the PowerPoint files, where I first thought he was just impressed with them, but before I was called to a meeting with him, then a later one with the vice dean, and finally one with other senior management, who produced my contract's severance articles. They indicated the complaints had extended to slides beyond the Taiwan non-issue and my discussions of them, which would have had any equivalent group of Westerners rolling on the floor at this point and making jokes about me being a CIA asset. But the managers genuinely sided with the complaints and scrutinized the slides carefully. These slides included a tiny schematic map in a corner designed to look like the Chinese flag, and simplified to exclude Taiwan and Hainan Islands, and was clearly there as a prompt for me to mention about China's leading position between the ancient and modern worlds in the West. The managers were greatly bothered by this, while showing them a parallel example of the UK that cut the surrounding Orkney Islands, Shetland Islands, Isle of Wight, and Isle of Man made zero difference. Then they were riled by maps with political content, including of the historical successes of communism, of the European Union with the UK still in it, of economic blocs to ask if Europe should be a country to compare with the US and China, of the British counties and regions, of international leisure travel options, and of diverse other areas. The managers read all sorts of fantastical sedition into these to compare with the main maps, and I mostly let them carry on as thinking better of correcting psychopaths. I was further criticized for slides of the famous photo of Mao Zedong and President Nixon shaking hands, me saluting a famous statue of Mao on a visit out of personal interest to his hometown, the Statue of Liberty while describing its expression of individuality, the White House, the British government building, and British surveillance and speed cameras. The Chinese staff were shocked at a Westerner's evident readiness and ease in questioning anything and everything with no regard at all for authority first. They tried to phrase this saying Westerners criticize their political leaders, whereas Chinese don't, but when I wasn't particularly criticizing anyone. They just indicated an inability for normal separation of mature-minded investigative academic practice from unrelated whatever power structures or dimly perceived personal affronts. They took me asking very old questions like, is it okay for films to have violence? Or when is lying a good idea? As controversial and disconcerting, with the worry that my next question may therefore involve criticizing President Xi Jinping. However, in less developed societies with weaker organization or contract, less predictable behavior from citizenry may indeed a worry. A level of civic maturity hasn't been reached where a society can have order without repression. I argued that a counter-complaint should be made for libel, while my long-term Nanjing girlfriend urged we likewise went to the police, but management insisted on dissolving it and protecting me in their own ways. One Chinese staff, however, like me, saw the whole process as prearranged, where a relatively rich foreigner could take some mistreatment for purposes of CCP tentacles reaching around corners to keep staff and students off balance. To be continued. Any questions?